but please welcome Richard, who's going to give us his talk now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pam, and good evening, everybody. Yeah, when Pam asked me to prepare something for this, I think it's fair to say energy prices were probably considered quite high then, probably even very high, but they certainly weren't quite as ridiculous as they've managed to get to in the last few weeks. So I'll stick to the script, so to speak, and talk about net zero carbon, which is the title of the presentation, but by all means, if anybody has any more general energy questions, then I'll do what I can to answer those at the end as well. So just very quickly, in terms of who I am and why I'm here. So I work for LG Energy Group, who are the energy consultancy partner to the Cast Metals Federation, and we advise CMF members and other manufacturers on everything from energy reduction and energy purchasing and legislation to increasingly these days net zero energy management. So I think to start off with, it's worth defining what is a net zero organization, or what should one be, and primarily it's one that's highly energy efficient, and I think these points are purposefully in this order. So it's energy efficient first and foremost. It's fully powered from renewable sources, and that could be off-site, i.e. purchased green electricity, or on-site generated electricity or renewable-based heat. And then any remaining balance, carbon balance, is then offset, and that is always the last resort. So there's some natural and applicable skepticism to the idea that you can just offset everything and say, well, there we go, haven't we done a good job, we're net zero. But no, it's about being efficient in the first instance, then looking at procuring the energy from green sources, and then offsetting as a final step. But there's also a point which now makes itself a little more apparent, that through non-use of energy or reduced use of energy, you're reducing a significant cost within the business, and obviously that's never been more true than today. So it's also one that wants and aims to be lean and insulate itself from market volatility. Okay, so the background to the concept of net zero is always, it's not a new idea. You would have referred to it previously as being carbon neutral or having an energy reduction strategy or plan, but this idea of net zero came about from the Paris Agreement, which was accepted and adopted by governments and further down into businesses as a commitment to limit the temperature rise that the world will see due to global warming.
Richard, sorry to interrupt. Richard, just are you intending to move your slides on, or you're still on the home slide? Is that intentional? Okay, I'm not on my screen, so I have moved them on. Is that no? They're still. Well, I can see the first slide only. There we are. Now it's moving. That's better. That's slide 2, I think. Or no, sorry, okay. Slide 4. Yeah. I'll
assume there's a little lag, and I'll click through. So I'll click onto the Paris Agreement. So I'm sorry, I've been clicking through mine on cue. Apologies, it didn't go through. So you'll see my little side slides now, but that's not a problem. Can you see the one marked Paris Agreement now then?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Yes,
okay.
We can.
Okay, no problem. So the Paris Agreement's aim was to limit global energy temperature rises to, initially it said to at worst 2 degrees, but ideally limit it to 1.5 degrees. In recent, well, this year at least, that 2 degrees has been scrapped, and 1.5 has become the outright commitment. So there's an organisation you might have heard of if you heard anybody referring to science-based targets. So Science-Based Targets International will accept and approve the net zero carbon plans that businesses put to them, but they would only accept them now if they are in line with that organisation adjusting its emissions in line with limiting global increase to 1.5 degrees. So it's making sure everybody's on the same kind of trajectory. Now, that doesn't mean that if you enter into a net zero carbon plan or strategy that you also have to do that. You could have a less ambitious one, you could have a more ambitious one. But the idea was to get some kind of universal acceptance of what is a good, a good aim for a net zero strategy. So limiting global increases to 1.5 degrees is now the agreed aim of them. The reasons to do it, again, first and foremost, to reduce cost, and without pointing out the completely obvious, the best cost avoidance approach for non-energy use is to simply not use energy in the first place, i.e. to be as efficient as possible. And by doing so, you're avoiding that carbon and you're avoiding the cost of that energy. The cost element of that will obviously provide you with a payback for whatever that activity is. And that cost element has clearly rocketed. And whilst the prices that we see right now today for this winter are, we hope, are not here to stay, I think it's fair to assume that there'll be a legacy from this, that energy prices going forwards will be quite a bit more than we've been used to in the past. And the silver lining, if you like, to that is that the paybacks for these same energy reduction activities will now look an awful lot more healthy, and hopefully get some of those below that acceptable rate. And whatever is acceptable, what's acceptable to one business is different to another. But if something was looking at an 8-year payback before and was therefore dismissed and might now be down to a 5-year payback, then that might help a project get over the line. And quite a few businesses also extend their usual payback criteria if there's environmental benefit to that activity. So they might have a 3-year payback criteria for most investment projects, but 5 years if it also contributes to their net zero approach or brings about an environmental benefit. So cost is a key element of a net zero strategy. Also satisfying supply chain and upward and downward supply chain pressures, and particularly upward of customers who are saying, well, what are you doing? Are you doing your part? And certainly we see it a lot in the automotive sector. Car manufacturers coming out with bold claims about being net zero, but obviously the responsibility for achieving that tends to fall on the supply chain. Likewise in retail. There's a social responsibility to protect the environment and achieve those global, or limit those global temperature increases as per the Paris Agreement. And also there's an expectation now amongst stakeholders and others that businesses will be doing that and doing the right thing. And obviously avoiding a visit from Greta. So in terms of what that pathway might look like, I'd say this is probably the most important slide to understand, or the most important sort of representation of what is included in that net zero strategy. So the approach to zero, the idea is you take your carbon footprint as of today and you formulate a plan as to how you will get that to zero. And it's not the ambition of one to, well, it's not the ambition for most anyway, to achieve zero carbon outputs by, in a year's time or 3 years' time or even 5 years' time. But most of these talk about 2030, 2035, 2040, 2050 even. Like I said, everybody can go on their own journey. So it's not about achieving the impossible overnight. It's about having a plan to get there. So in terms of what's included in that initial carbon footprint that you plan to reduce down to zero by some point, you have scope 1, which is all direct emissions attributable to the business, which is primarily gas consumed on site and company vehicles or employees' vehicles for which the company pays a mileage allowance. So there are direct emissions from that activity to atmosphere. And then scope 2, indirect emissions, is primarily electricity. So again, directly linked to the business, but the emissions don't take place at the site, but they're still part of that business's direct emissions, if you like. So that's scope 1 and scope 2, and they're what everybody has pretty much always thought of as your carbon footprint, your electricity and your gas and your transportation. Scope 3 is kind of everything else, and so the first task of a net zero strategy is to say, well, what's in scope? Well, scope 1 and 2 are always in scope, but what aspects of scope 3 would then be included? And typically, as a minimum, you would look at waste and water and transportation of product and people. Beyond that, you can start looking at the raw material carbon footprint, but that, of course, gets a little more complicated because that's not your carbon footprint, it's a carbon footprint effectively of your supply chain. It's their scope 1 and 2, if you like, going into the raw materials. You can expand it to include anything and everything crossing the threshold of the business, everything leaving the business. There's no limit to what it can include, but there's obviously a sort of a sensible limit to making sure that you include things that you can affect and you can monitor and you can report, because if you can't affect it or you can't monitor it, then there's little point spending time trying to calculate what it is. So it's defining that in the first instance. And like I said, probably at its most simple, you've got scope 1 and scope 2, but typically it has scope 1 and scope 2 plus waste, transportation and water. So there currently isn't any legislative obligation to have a net zero strategy. It's more of a, like we talked about before, supply chain and you know, corporate social responsibility pressure. But there are a number of bits of energy legislation which many larger organisations are caught by. Any organisation that's not classified as an SME would be caught by ESOS, which is the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, which is mandatory energy auditing of sites, and SECR, which is Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, which is mandatory annual reporting of scope 1 and 2 carbon footprint. So electricity, gas and transport, and that's actually part of the Financial Regulations Act. So it has to be, that information now has to be included in an organisation's director's report and your financial report. It's got to have a carbon footprint section in there now. So they exist and they're mandatory, and therefore it's for organisations that are caught by those, it's not a big jump to then, so actually we're going to use this mandatory auditing that we have to do and this mandatory reporting we have to do to be the basis of our net zero plan. And if any organisation is captured by a climate change agreement, where they get reductions on green levies in return for annual reductions in their energy consumption, then they've got an added incentive to get on board with a net zero approach as well. So it's not, net zero is not obligated on businesses right now, but it's, you can see that it's getting there with quite a few of the existing bits of legislation, and it'll be no surprise really if it does become compliant on organisations in the near future. So in terms of what that sort of pathway would look like, I would say this is pretty much a pathway for any kind of investment project, not specifically net zero. But here we've got the idea of, well, where do you consider yourself to be, from no idea whatsoever to, well, actually we're pretty good, thank you very much. Diagnose what needs to be done through looking at the information, the data and what can be achieved, identify the opportunities, design them. As you implement them, obviously you've got to look to finance, self-finance, external finance and so on. And once they're built and deployed and running, you're then optimizing that information, feeding that information back to the beginning to see how you can do it again, how you can do it better. So again, you might have seen similar sort of charts to that. It's not specifically net zero, but it does apply equally to that net zero approach and strategy and all of the various projects and energy reduction exercises and technologies that would form part of that. So in terms of those technologies, this is a sort of, I suppose, a high-level way of showing, well, you've got things that everybody accepts and knows now and are sort of proven technology. So LED lighting, tell me what that is, or energy insight and analysis and looking at your energy consumption data. Fine, you know, they're all things that everybody almost does in their sleep these days. But as you sort of progress down this, and sort of lower down the carbon level and further on in time, you know, we're getting into things like on-site solar. Fine, I think that's now becoming pretty mainstream and established. Heat pumps, again, a little bit further on down the line. And then we've got battery storage, longer term battery storage, being able to store energy on site. Ideally, if it's from renewable sources, you can power yourself from solar PV at night from overproduction in the day. Buildings with integrated solar PV, solar roofs and so on, and that becoming part of an ordinary building fabric. And then quite a lot of references here to hydrogen, and there's a lot of talk about hydrogen as a solution to the big question on the net zero side, which is gas. So I think everybody is pretty familiar with renewable forms of electricity generation, but gas is a much harder one to solve, and hydrogen is hoped and suspected by many as being the solution, but at the minute it's not commercially mainstream. The technology is there. The issue is the hydrolysis of water to produce hydrogen takes huge amounts of electricity, so you're almost back to square one, because now you need more electricity, and therefore you need, if it's going to be sustainable hydrogen, more renewable electricity generation just to make hydrogen. And clearly we're already in a position where we need more electricity generation, renewable electricity generation, to cope with electricity demand, although that is also part of the problem of high energy prices right now as well, which I'll come back to later. This is largely the same information, just on a sort of mock-up building, and where each of those individual technologies and solutions may apply. But in terms of what it actually means on an individual company basis, and obviously every company is different, but this is a sort of sample report from an energy audit, where you would look at, well, what's the annual energy saving in kilowatt hours and percentage terms. Likewise for gas, if it applies to gas, doesn't on this one, and then the cost and the payback of doing so. Some of these are very, very low cost, easy, simple things to do, but it doesn't mean that they always get done, because they don't, so they need to be implemented. And then you've got investment in solar PV down here, where you've got a sort of 5.4 year payback, but again, this audit is more probably 12 months old, and therefore that payback might be looking at a much more attractive 3.5 years right now. There's also on here a gas engine. Well, a gas engine was part of one of the proposed recommendations from this survey, but that wouldn't typically be part of a net zero strategy. But equally, it could be if the idea was, well, look at the savings on it, £800,000 a year and a sub 2 year payback. We could use that £800,000 a year to fund the decarbonisation rather of the business going forwards, and that's some people's attitude. They might take some short-term moves that don't help the net zero journey, with a view to reinvest in those savings in making it up in years 3, 4, 5, and so on. So that might not be, that wouldn't be typical, I must say, but it does happen. So in terms of some practical applications, in terms of technologies and approaches, there's some fairly simple and easy wins. Again, LED lighting is clearly very well documented. Everybody knows the benefit of it, but it's still, we're still some way to achieving the rollout of that we need. Voltage optimization, it can also be quite an easy win. Doesn't have a great impact on inductive load and so therefore electrical heating, but anything motive, pumps, compressors and so on, it can generate often savings of sort of between 6 and 9% quite easily, where voltage is supplied at high levels. So it could be 243, 245 volts into a site when all that's technically needed is 220. And the right voltage optimization application can be quite a good shot in the arm to anybody's energy reduction targets and strategies. Likewise, power factor correction is a fairly easy solution, and increased monitoring and automated control of elements, particularly ventilation and heating and areas like that. If you're monitoring energy use in order to see the impact of the changes that you're making is a very key part of an energy reduction strategy, because if you can't see the impact, it's then hard to know exactly how well you're doing and where you're achieving success and where you're not. So increased monitoring, and that's often coupled with automated control. We talked about solar PV. I mentioned CHP before being primarily a gas-based solution, but can also be a biofuel solution. And increasingly, CHP engines being installed now would usually be able to run on up to 40% hydrogen, some of them on 100% hydrogen. So they are future-proofed for when that happens, but obviously when that happens is slightly out of all of our hands. Wind energy still viable. Usually, or these days, a lot of new wind is offshore. There seems to be a preference for offshore wind, but there's also plenty of new onshore wind turbines going up, and plenty of manufacturing sites as well as more rural locations. And batteries always come into this, because batteries solve an awful lot of problems. They obviously don't generate electricity, they simply store it. But if every organization had a battery, reasonable sized battery on site, then the whole concept of balancing the grid and managing the output from renewable technologies and so on would be infinitely more simple. So it's hard to see batteries not forming part of the solution. But again, ultimately, you still need the green source electricity to feed the battery in order to make it work. So it's in there by default, let's say. And something else that tends to get overlooked, often in favour of more technology-driven solutions, is behavioural change, because everything that consumes energy on site is either the result of a piece of technology or the result of an individual. So getting that concept of what you're doing and that idea of a net zero plan across all areas of the business, from the boardroom down to the factory floor, is really important, and integrating that approach and culture into other decisions and decision-making processes within the business. Making sure that everybody is fully aware of what the end goal is and what the plan is to achieve it, and working that into the practices of the organisation, or individuals' targets or management targets and so on, so that it penetrates right into the business. And then taking the same approach to minimise other non-sustainable practices within the business, from over printing of emails and that kind of thing. Sometimes it's the small things, but if it feeds right down and everybody starts getting on board with the more sustainable approach, then that's going to help the organisation generally achieve their goal. And also outward communication of the same thing. So if suppliers, customers, clients, the wider public are aware of what you're trying to do, then it sort of increases interest in it. It will increase interest in, hopefully, the products themselves, because there's a clamour now for manufacturing that is sustainable, that is in line with net zero practices, and it's becoming part of other organisations' tender criteria. The NHS has just put it in all theirs. They won't provide contracts to anybody that's not got a net zero strategy in place. So we'll see that more and more. So make sure if you're doing it, you're outwardly communicating about it. And then obviously annual reporting of how you do. So you may be compelled to do that if you're captured by the energy and carbon reporting, but even if you're not, make sure you're reporting your carbon footprint and telling people about all of your good work. And then finally, as I said at the beginning, it's about energy efficiency. It's about effective energy procurement. You can go out and you can buy green power from your supplier typically, but there's also other ways of accessing green energy, and there's also other ways of contributing to the whole sort of net zero approach. So there's corporate PPAs where you can contract with a generator, a renewable generator, to purchase some or all of their output and have that energy sleeved into your energy contract. There's the idea of a private wire. That's normally something you've got to be fairly fortuitous to be able to achieve. If you have a wind farm next door to your site, then great, you can literally run a private wire over and take energy that way, but not everybody is in that position. But there are sort of virtual private wire or virtual power plant type approaches where you can also contract directly with generators and local generators to take their energy and purchase their energy from them, and that way that energy is staying local, which also has a benefit in terms of losses from national transportation distribution. If you are generating on site yourselves through solar PV, how you export to grid, are you spinning to grid at the weekend, perhaps when the site isn't there, but the solar's obviously still generating, and then you can utilize, if you are, you can utilize the green credentials of that electricity to offset your own elsewhere. And then finally, with whatever's left, and ultimately if you want to get to zero, there will be an element, or potentially be an element, that you need to offset. And there are now very many Kyoto compliant offsetting schemes. So there was some bad press around these some years ago about tree planting and this, that and the other, and but there's now quite a robust structure in place to verify all of these offsetting schemes, and some are more expensive than others because they have perhaps a more local impact, or they have a more demonstrable impact. But there are a variety of offset schemes to choose from. But again, I would always stress that that's the last resort, not the plan isn't just simply to offset everything from the word go and say you've done it. So to summarize, in terms of where to start, if you haven't started already, again, establish the scope. So what do you want to include? What do you want? What can you quantify and count and report? And what do you want to include? And then state an ultimate aim, which could be a date sometime in the future. But at the same time, don't worry that you have to get everything right now, because things will change and you can reset those goals and those aims in a few years' time, maybe make them more ambitious, less ambitious, whatever. But it's better to be doing something now and have a plan now and be acting upon it, than to be pushing it down the road for another couple of years and then not getting ahead of the energy reduction implementation. So once you've done that, you would establish your year one carbon footprint, and that would then be your baseline, if you like, that you would then look to reduce from. You would have a strategy lined out of the priorities based on the cost element and the carbon impact of them, and so there'll be plenty that you can do now. There might be some investment opportunities that you want to make now because the paybacks look very, very good. And there might be things that you're thinking, well, this is great, but we'll probably be lining this up years 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. But to have those on the agenda, so they can on the in the plan, so that they can be accrued for and make sure they do happen. You need a slightly longer term plan. Again, internal and external communication of all of this is vital, and to report your progress of it, probably in line with the existing government energy and carbon reporting, because why not? Because that's what everybody else is doing. And then to adjust as you go on as well. New technologies come on, priorities change. There might be more legislation, might be targets upon you, your own business priorities might change, site changes, etc., etc. So all of these things will cause you to reset, but it's a case of keeping an open mind to keep the net zero plan topical and applicable to where you're at in 3, 5, 8, 10 years time. And that brings us to the end. So I would just add, there's no right kind of plan, and everybody's plan looks slightly different. But hopefully that will give you a little bit of a flavour as to how you would go about setting one in the first instance.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Lots of food for thought there.